Hello guys, welcome to NestJs tutorial. This is going to be a practical introduction to Nest. Our goal is to understand the NestJs project structure. In line with that goal, we are going to create a simple Nest application from scratch. Although Nest has a CLI tool, a command line tool for generating a new project, some project files and all that, we are not going to make use of the CLI tool. Creating a new Nest application from scratch in this lesson at least will help us better understand how things are wired up in a Nest application. Also, when you start making use of the CLI tool, you will have a better understanding of the files and codes it is generating for you. Just a quick refresher, NestJs is a Node.js framework. So it is based on Node.js. It uses TypeScript by default. So if you don't have knowledge of TypeScript, that should be the place to start from. And of course, being a Node.js framework, you also need at least basic knowledge of Node.js. With that in mind, let's get started. Let's create an empty folder for the project. You can go anywhere in your computer, wherever you prefer. Create a folder. You can call that folder anything, for example, my app. Then open that folder in the terminal, in the command line. The first thing we are going to do is to initialize an empty node project. So to do that, we say npm init-y. That will create an empty project. You can then open that folder, the project, in your code editor. I'll open that in VS Code. Basically, the only thing we have is a package.json file. The next thing we are going to do is to install some packages that we need for the project. From the official documentation, this is an example of those packages we need to create a project from scratch. These two are from the NestJs library itself. This is for observables. I'm not sure we are going to import this in our project. Reflect metadata is for adding metadata to classes and properties, etc. Let me copy this over to the terminal. Copy the entire line of code starting from npm. Hit enter and we wait for that to install. Before we go ahead to write some codes, let's install two more packages. NestJs does not handle HTTP requests on its own by default. Instead, it relies on third-party packages such as Express or Fastify to handle HTTP requests. So we should go ahead and install the package for that. In addition, we need to install TypeScript. Remember that Nest uses TypeScript by default. So npm install at NestJs platform express and then TypeScript. Enter and we wait for that to install. Let's open up the project and see what we have. Basically, we have the node modules, the package.json. We have installed 5 packages. We need to create a config file for TypeScript. So in the root of the project, I will create a file tsconfig.json. Inside the file, I want to paste a basic configuration. This is telling TypeScript how to compile our project. With the config out of the way, let's talk about the project structure. A typical Nest application has various components that make up the entire project. I'm not going to cover every single thing. For example, There are controllers, which are the obvious one, provider, module, middleware, exception filters, interceptors, etc. Our focus will be on some of the most commonly used ones, which are what I have on the screen. Starting from the right, we have the repository. Repository contains the codes we use to talk to the data source. Data source in this case can be a database, it can be a file system, or some remote source. So those codes we use to talk to the database, for example, goes into the repository. Then we have the service. The service is basically used to handle the data between the data source and the other parts of the code, in this case, the controller. As an example, let's imagine that this is authentication service that handles registration, login, etc. When the user wants to register with their email and password, the part of the code that hashes the password will be contained in the service. After that, the service can call the method that stores data in the database to store that record. This is just one example how the service differs from the repository, that is in terms of what they do. The controller is used to handle the incoming request and send out response. Pipe is oftentimes used for data validation. As you can see, the controller makes use of the pipe to validate the incoming request and also makes use of the service. That is, it calls the methods in the service class. So this is a summary of the things we are going to implement in this lesson as we go further. Over to the code. The next thing we are going to do is to create a main.ts file. So in the root of the project, main.ts file, this is the starting point of our Nest application. It will contain the codes that will kind of bootstrap the application. At the top, let's go ahead and make some imports from Nest core. What we want to import from there is Nest factory. Down here, we bootstrap the application. This is like the starting point of the application. We say const, no need, let's use normal function, async function bootstrap. Const app await nest factory.create. This is used to create an instance of the Nest application. However, this expects us to pass a module, like the root module for the entire application. Let's take a look at this diagram to help us understand what I mean by the root module. So a Nest application has several modules that group related codes or related functionalities. An application will have a root module. That is what we need in that create method. So let's go ahead and make a module. Once again, at the root of the project, I will make another file, app.module.ts. That is by convention, app.module.ts. Inside that file, we are going to export a class like so, export class app module. So this is just by convention. We name the file app.module.ts and here we call it app module. However, this does not qualify as a module yet unless we decorate it as so. What we're going to do is to import a class from NestJs common. That class is called module. And down here, we need to decorate this as a module that expects some configurations, which we'll get back to later in a moment. And then inside the main.ts, we need to import from app module, app module. Finally, we pass app module to the create method. The next line is to tell the app to listen, that is to start the server, app.listen 3000, not 300, 3000. Okay, I think we have met the bare minimum. Let's come down here and call that function bootstrap. Alright, at this point, let's check our diagram again. We said that we need controller to handle the incoming request and send out response. So let's go back to the code and create the controller file. In the root again, we create a new file app.controller.ts. Inside here, we export a class, export class app controller. Again, the naming convention. We have it as app.controller.ts here. Inside here, we call it app controller. However, this does not really fully qualify as a controller. Let's pass a decorator to it to mark it as a controller. So at the top, we import from NestJs command controller decorator. And then here, we mark this as controller. Inside the controller, we begin to define the routes and the route handler. That is the route and the methods that handle the request for that route. To do that, actually, we need to import more decorator, get, which is used to handle get request. So let's say I have a method home. At the top, I will mark this with get. This takes the path, the route actually, or the relative path, the URL. So this means when the user visits http :// localhost 3000 according to our definition here, then /home, this method should handle that request, right? If we remove home, that means the same thing as visiting http :// 3000. Let's actually leave it like this. At this point, let's just return hello world. I'm not trying to build some complex stuff here, just to understand the structure. Okay, now we can go back to the app module and add our controller there. Controllers, here we can list all the controllers for this module. So app controller. Make sure to import that app controller. At this point, we can go ahead and test what we have so far. Over to the terminal at the project directory. I'm going to run the command npx tsnode dev. The main file is main.ts, so main.ts. Hit enter. Note that when using the Nest CLI, we are not going to use this command. There's a better or more convenient command to actually start up the server. But because we are not making use of the CLI, that is why we are going this route. Alright, it looks like our server started successfully. You can see at this line. Let's visit the URL in the browser. I'll go ahead and navigate to localhost 3000. Okay. So we get our response, hello world. That is for the first route we added. Okay, so far so good. Looking at the project structure so far, all the files we have created are in the root folder, in the root directory. Usually, we make an src folder to put our codes. So the 3 files we have created so far, the controller, the module, and the main.ts should go inside the src folder. I'll go ahead and move the three of them. It therefore means that if we want to start the server again, let me stop this. We have to include the src before main.ts. src slash main.ts, start the server once again. The server is up and running. You can go back to the browser and refresh this, no issues. So take note of this grouping here. Looking at our diagram, so far we have the app module, and app controller. We have at least 3 more items left. Let's go back to the code and do those 3 things. Usually, the codes, the files that relate to the app module are located directly inside the src folder. But let's assume you have multiple other modules. For example, let's say users module. We shouldn't have the file all cluttered inside the src folder. Instead, we make a folder. Let's call that users. Inside users, all the files that relate to users module can now go into the folder. For example, let's have users.controller.ts, and for the repository, users.repository.ts, and for the service class, users.service.ts. One last file there, the pipe, this is usually called DTO. DTO stands for Data Transfer Object. We are going to make use of it here for validation. So we are going to add another file. Let's call that users.dto.ts. Let's start with the repository class. Here we're just going to export a class. We call that users repository. Let's have a method for creating a user. This should take email. It should be a string, and password, that will also be a string at very least. This is where you do stuff like talking to a database to store the user information and all that. But you're not going to go into database. So let me just put a comment, create record in the DB, do whatever I want to do, and finally let's return a fake data for user. Let's say ID1, email to be email. I need to type that? No, I don't need to. So we are not going to do any database here, but just for demonstration purposes. Then over to the service class, we are going to have similar method, export class, users service. Here let's also have a method create. It is not a must to name it create, but oftentimes it is intuitive when it's easier to understand when we do something like that. This will also take email, which will be a string, and password, which is also a string. But like we said, the logic such as hashing the password and all that goes into the service. The service class eventually makes use of the repository, for example, to save the user after we have done all those processing. For that, we need to bring in the repository. We have to do that in the constructor. Private users repo to be of type, we call it repository. Users repository. Then down here, we can do stuff like hash, password, and etc. Finally, we say this dot users repo dot create. We pass the email and password. Save that. Then we move over to the controller. Here, I'll quickly export class users controller. Similar to what we did before, we import some decorators from NestJs command. From NestJs command, we imported controller. This time we import post instead of get. And we apply that decorator here. This is controller. Inside here, let's have a post. No, not that. Post. Down here, let's call the method create user. So we want to have a route URL like this: http://localhost 3000/users. Instead of applying this to each route we are going to have inside user, you can say users, maybe let's say we have get user/id. You can see that users, we keep repeating in each one of them. So what we can do is, let me undo this. I'm not doing any get here. What we can do is to come to the controller and apply that users. So we can remove this from here. That will give us the same result. So for this post, it's going to be localhost 3000/users. That will hit the post method, the create user method. And then we do something similar to what we did in the service. We import the service class into the controller. So we say private users service to be of type users service. Down here, we say this.userservice.create. This is expecting email and password. How do we get those from the request? To get the request body, let's import another one. We import body. Then here we say at body. But we need to validate whatever that is in the request, right? We can't just accept anything and pass over to the whatever method we need to pass it over to. So we need to go to the DTO class and define some validation logic. Over to the DTO, let's export class. Let's call that create user DTO. We are expecting email, which will be a string, and password, that will also be a string. But this is not enough. We have not applied any validation logic. To apply the validation rules, we need to make use of another package. So let's quickly install that. I will go over to the terminal. What we need is npm install class validator class transformer. Let me check the spelling. Validator transformer. Enter. Okay, we are done with the installation. Back to the code, we need to import from class validator. What we need is the row is email and is string. Then down here we apply is email, basically saying that this must be an email, and is string for the password. Back to the controller, we need to say that this should be of type create user DTO. Make sure to import that, right? And then down here we can say body dot email, body dot password to satisfy the condition for this method. Actually, I don't like typing body dot this, body dot that all the time. Let's do some destructuring. I will come over here, replace this with this email password. I think that's a little better. At this point, let's wire things up. I noticed that we missed one important file here, and that is the users module. So let's quickly add that. Users.module.ts. Remember that the module is like the guy that brings together every other thing that belongs to that same module. So users module. Here we export class users module. We are going to do a couple of imports. Import from NestJs common module, and then we import the service from users service users repository. Doesn't matter. Let's import the service quickly. Service user service, and finally let's import the controller from controller users user controller. Okay, here we declare this to be a module, and we can pass some options to this metadata. We have seen controllers before. This is where we list the controllers for this module. In this case, we just have users controller. The next item will help us to import the user service. So that is providers. Here we import the injectable users service. I think that's basically it. Looking back at our diagram, you can see that the modules, the different modules, need to be wired up together somehow. So for example, this is our users module. We need to go to the app module and include that. App module is the base module. Here we add imports, and we want to import users module. Make sure to import that. Now we have connected the users module to the app module. At this point, let's pause and test our users module. Because what we have here is a post request, we cannot just call this in the browser. To quickly test this, you can use Postman or whatever client you prefer, but we can actually install an extension that helps us do that. REST client, that is the VS Code extension. Install the extension. With that extension installed, what we are going to do is close this. What we're going to do is go to the users module inside the folder, not the file. We create a file called request.http. Then here we put the pound, the hash symbol 3 times. Let's say create user, and then down here we're going to have post http://localhost 3000 / users, because that is the endpoint we have in the users controller. Remember these users here. This will be expecting some request body, so we give some space, and of course content type should be application/JSON. Application/JSON. Make sure to add the header content type. We need email. Let's say a@b.c.com, and password 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, whatever. Before sending the request, let's restart the server. Our server is up and running, so let's send the request. We get a response, internal server error. I can go to the console to find out what the problem is. Says cannot read properties of undefined reading weight. Let's check that out. So guys, I had to pause the video to figure out what the problem is. If you take a look at this constructor here, you can see we are making use of dependency injection. So we need to go to user service. Here, what we need to do is, let me go to the top, import injectable from NestJs common. So we need to mark this as injectable. We mark the class as injectable. We head over to the repository and do the same thing. So over here, we import that class injectable and mark this class as injectable. So make sure to import that. And one more thing, let's go over to the users module. Over here, we imported users repository, but we did not add it in the providers. We basically need to add it here. Our injectables, we need to add them here. So users repository, I will save that. Now let's make sure that the server is okay. I'll start the server again. Clear this, start the server. The server is up and running. We try sending the request one more time. Send. Okay, now we have the expected response. It works as expected. What if we supply an invalid input? For example, instead of valid email, we can just put some random stuff there. When we send this request, we expect that our validation should work, right? But that is not the case, so let me go ahead and send this. We still get the correct response. So something is not working as expected, right? The reason this is not working yet is, despite that, where is it? The DTO. Despite that we have these validation rules here, we still need to do one additional step. What we need to do is to go to main.ts and tell NestJs to use validation pipes. How we do that is we say app dot use global pipes. We want to apply that globally. Validation new validation pipe. The validation pipe is imported from NestJs common. You can see it up there. This is how we make sure that the validation is applied. So I'll go back to the request, send it one more time. The server is trying to restart. That is why I'm getting that down there. So I think it has started now. Send it again. This time we get the proper validation errors saying that email must be a valid email. And of course, if I put something that is not a string for the password and I send the request, we also get that password must be valid. But if everything is valid, of course, we expect the thing to work. So I send valid request, we get valid response. Alright guys, please hit the like button and subscribe if you have not done so. This will help my channel to grow and so that my content can get to people that need them. Thank you very much as you do that. Just a quick recap of what we have done, what you have learned in this lesson. So we have tried to wire up a Nest application from scratch. Our goal is to understand how Nest application is structured. That is why we took the approach of creating things from scratch instead of using the CLI, right? We said that Nest follows certain conventions, certain structures. It encourages us to follow certain best practices. For example, we group related codes inside the folders and we follow certain naming conventions. We make use of repository services, pipes, DTOs, etc., to stay organized, to apply that separation of concerns, and so that we can have code that are easier to maintain and scale. We learned that module is used to group related codes, and for a Nest application there is a root module. For example, in this case we have app module to be our root module, and somehow other modules has to be connected to the root module, right? For example, if we have another module, let's say account module, we have to add it to the list of modules we have here. Then we made use of repository. We said that repository is for the codes to talk to the data source. For example, querying the database. And then we have the service class for the business logic, basically. And of course, the controller that handles the request and sends out the response. We use this DTO class file to validate incoming requests. So this is how we make things stay organized and easier to understand and manage. I believe that this lesson has really helped us understand at least the very basics, the structure of Nest application. Alright guys, so until next time, happy coding.